As you remember, Paul has been, over the course of many verses now, warning the Colossian Christians about the dangers of the false teachers who have been trying to gain influence over them. These false teachers, it seems like they were everywhere. They're ubiquitous. They're always trying to get in and to lead God's people astray. In last week's passage, he cautioned them about those who would instruct them in the ways of asceticism, extreme self-denial, or the pleasure in self-abasement, as well as giving them a warning about the worship of angels and how that was not to be. And now he's warning them about a specific form of asceticism that commands them, do not handle, do not taste, do not touch. The concern that must have been expressed by these false teachers was that to do those things, to handle, to taste, to touch, would defile someone who is now clean in Christ. And you can sense that the carryover from Judaism of the food restrictions and what Paul is quoting these teachers as saying. As one commentator wrote, the two arguments here advanced against regulations of this sort are so close to those found on the lips of Jesus that many scholars have suggested a conscious echo on Paul's part. That Paul had in mind what Jesus said in Matthew chapter 15 and Mark 7. And in those chapters, Jesus said it wasn't what went into their mouths that made them unclean, but what comes out, their behavior, the sexual immorality, the slander, the things that they said, the things that they do. This is what defiled them. You may be aware of this. The Jewish dietary laws had set Israel apart from the different nations who surrounded them for 2,000 years. But Jesus taught that they were simply intended to point out to them the concept of holiness, not to be a means unto holiness. Diets, what people are willing to eat and what they refuse to eat, either draw people together or they separate them. Now, I recently watched a video of an ethnically Russian man who had grown up in China. Apparently his family, his grandparents had fled the Bolshevik Revolution and they went to China. And this man spoke Mandarin flawlessly. He had all of the mannerisms and the characteristics of a Chinese man except the appearance. And in the course of this video, this man, he was seen going to the market. He purchased various ingredients. He went back to his house. And one of those ingredients was a hog's head. A hog's head. And he cut that head in half and he put it in this wok and he began to cook it. And he mixed it with various ingredients. And then at the end of the video, he delightfully takes a bite out of the pig's snout and out of its ear and out of its tongue. And he is having the most fun and he makes it look so good. And as he devoured his meal, I thought to myself, I think I would starve if I were there. But it was clear that he was in complete, total enjoyment of the food that he'd just prepared. The problem that Jesus and Paul had with people who refused to eat the so-called unclean food of their day was that these people believed that the ones who ate the unclean food became unclean themselves. But what God has made clean, we are not permitted to call unclean. And that leads us to this statement that I would like you to hold before you as we work our way through this sermon this morning. To be truly clean means that you have died with Christ and have been brought to life by the Holy Spirit. To be truly clean means you have died with Christ and have been brought to life by the Holy Spirit. I've divided the sermon into three parts. The first part titled Elementary, My Dear. The second, Irregular Regulations. And the third, Pathetic Ascetics. So the first part of the sermon, Elementary, My Dear. The second, Irregular Regulations. And the third, Pathetic Ascetics. So let's consider this first point of the sermon, Elementary, My Dear. Paul asks a basic question of the Colossian Christians in verse 20, which I'll paraphrase here just so we can get our head around it. If with Christ you've died to the world, why do you still live as if you're a part of the world? Now that's an oversimplification of what Paul is asking, and yet his main point is that as believers in Christ, they have died to something, but they're acting like they still are alive to that thing. And the something in this case is what the ESV translates as the elemental spirits of the world. The King James translates it as the rudiments of the world. The New King James, similarly, the basic principles of the world. Now, the recent NIV translates it as the elemental spiritual forces of the world, but the 84 version of the NIV translates it as the elementary or basic principles of the world. Now, why do I run through all of those various permutations of this verse for you? Well, it gets at the ways, the nuances that this phrase is to be understood. You get a sense of the nuance of the meaning that the phrase behind them has. And Greg Beale says that an interpretation combining all of these nuances is probably what's best. And so in his commentary on this passage, Beale points out that there was a very similar phrase in common use among the Greek-speaking people of the time. Throughout the Hellenistic world, they would say this phrase. And he says the phrase was used often, repeatedly, and exclusively to refer to the elements that ancient peoples believed composed the world: air, earth, fire, and water. We've all heard of earth, wind, and fire. But there was one more. However, Beale maintains that Paul, with that common understanding in mind, still manages in Paul-like fashion to give it a little different meaning than how it was commonly used among the pagans of his day. And so Paul is essentially saying that if you believe in Jesus Christ, you have died to the old order of the world, to its elements, to its principalities and powers, its evil spiritual forces. All of this has come to an end for you, Paul says, with the death of Jesus Christ. And he implies that the Old Testament ceremonial regulations and the sacrificial system were a part of that old order. You aren't part of the old creation any longer. You're part of the new creation in Christ. And he's going to continue that thought in chapter 3, verses 1 and following. But for now, he spends a little time admonishing them for being tempted by the trap that these false teachers have laid before them. And that brings us to the second part of the sermon, irregular regulations. And so Paul asks, if you have died with Christ to the elemental spirits of the world, why, as if you were still alive in the world, do you submit to their regulations? Why are you still acting like you're subject to those regulations to which you've died? He's saying to them that by having faith in Christ, they have died to the world, but they are behaving like they're still alive to it. They're doing so by submitting to these man-made regulations. Well, these regulations are at the very best irregular. And at the worst, they're outright blasphemous, because in essence, they deny the death and the resurrection of Jesus Christ. The regulations Paul mentions specifically are do not handle, do not taste, do not touch. And one commentator points out that the verb here translated handle is stronger than that rendered touch, thus producing a downward sliding scale, which corresponds to the upward rise in absurd scrupulosity. And so a modern day rendering might be, don't handle that thing. Don't even touch it with a 10-foot pole. Stay away from it. We do the same thing today. How many of you have been told, you were told perhaps as a child, maybe you've even used this to your own children, to avoid even the appearance of evil? How many of you have heard that? You have to raise your hand. I won't embarrass you. But I'm sure a lot of us heard that. It's based on the King James translation of 1 Thessalonians 5:22, which says, abstain from all appearance of evil. But the meaning of the word appearance has changed in English. And so many Christians, based on the modern understanding of the word appearance, which was very different than when it was written in 1611. A modern understanding of appearance, many Christians weren't permitted on the basis of this interpretation to go to the movies, even to see a PG-rated movie, because it might appear that they were in a theater to see an R-rated movie. Many Christians weren't permitted to drink sparkling cider on New Year's Eve because it might look like they were drinking alcohol. They might have the appearance of doing something which was considered to be evil. And so at the time, the King James translation of this verse was fine because everyone understood that it meant whenever evil makes an appearance, stay away from it. But now we understand the same verse to mean that you can't do something that is perfectly permissible by Scripture because it might have the appearance of evil to someone, somewhere. And most modern English translations, even the New King James, say abstain from every form of evil or something very similar. We all understand what that means. Don't engage, don't get yourself involved, don't commit evil things, don't do evil things. In quoting these regulations, do not handle, do not taste, do not touch, Paul is referring back to what he said in chapter 2, verse 16. Therefore, let no one pass judgment on you in questions of food and drink. And there it was very clear. He was speaking of the Old Testament dietary restrictions. The dietary restrictions God gave to his Old Testament people, it set them apart from their unbelieving neighbors. They reminded Israel that they were distinct from the other nations. They're set apart. They're not like the other people who are surrounding them. But more than that, as Beale writes in his commentary, the main purpose of the dietary laws was to cleanse people so they could worship in the temple. If you ate the wrong foods, you would be prohibited from entering the temple. And by extension, if you associated with the wrong people, wrong because they ate wrong foods, you might be prohibited from entering the temple. But Paul says this has come to an end, and it must stop. These kinds of regulations have no place in Christ's church because Christ's sacrificial death on the cross brought them to an end. It's been scientifically proven that sharing a common meal, eating the same food while seated at the same table, has a unifying effect on the people who are participating in it. This is one reason why a family eating together at least once per day is so important. And sharing meals with fellow Christians builds unity in the same way. But when we refuse to eat with one another, when we refuse the food that someone else has made, for whatever reason, it can promote division. Now, early in our marriage, Jen and I invited a family to our house for dinner. I think you probably all know this. If you don't, I'll praise my wife here. Just a minute, embarrass her, turn her bright red. She's a good cook. She's a very good cook. She's always been a good cook. She's only gotten better as we've been married, which my waistline reflects. And she had prepared a wonderful meal. She'd spent a good deal of time working on it. And when the family came, they came in and they brought a number of containers with them. They did so somewhat surreptitiously. They weren't making a big deal of it. They brought these containers in, and then we were serving ourselves. They served themselves from what they had brought. They didn't, I don't believe, I may be wrong, Jen Brett probably remembers better than I do. I don't remember them touching the food that she had prepared. It was very strange. It was weird. I guess I would say these folks were a little quirky. You don't know who they are. They're not around here. But it was odd. And they did this in such a way as it almost escaped notice. It was only afterwards we're talking about it. Did they not eat anything that you prepared? They did so without comment, without apology. They just ate their own food. It was weird. We're sitting at the same table. They've got their food that they brought in with them. We have this massive amount of food that Jen had prepared for them. We thought they were friends. But it wasn't too long after that we never saw them again. For Paul and these false teachers, it went much deeper than that. It was to a degree about table fellowship, understanding this union that we have with one another, but it went much deeper than that. There's a theological underpinning to all of this. I don't think the family regarded us as unclean or untouchable. They just had some weird hang-ups over food that other people made, apparently. But these false teachers were essentially teaching that certain foods made you unclean, and to be unclean was to be outside the people of God. That's exactly what Paul dealt with in Antioch when Peter was there with him. You remember, in the book of Galatians, Peter would eat freely with the Gentiles before the folks from James came up, from Jerusalem. And as soon as these people who were friends of James came in, Peter disassociated himself with the Gentiles. He wouldn't sit down and eat with them. He would only eat with his fellow Jews. He was putting on a show for these people of James's party. There's a closeness. There's an intimacy that is shared over a meal that simply doesn't take place in other settings. However, as important as fellowship over meals is, Paul's anger was based on something more fundamental. He calls Peter's actions in Galatians 2, he referred to them as hypocritical. Peter, the rock, had stumbled. He was being insincere. He was being two-faced. He acted one way when these people weren't there, and then when they showed up, he acted completely differently. And the real problem with what Peter had done, the issue that Paul was so exercised over, was the theological principle that lay behind Peter's actions. By what he did, Peter was saying that the Gentiles in the church at Antioch were not members of the household of faith. He was excommunicating them from the church. He was saying that they were unclean. He was saying by his actions they were not true Christians, and he could not sit down and enjoy a meal with them. And he was doing so because they hadn't been circumcised. And that's effectively what the false teachers were saying with their prohibitions against handling and tasting and touching. Now, Paul goes on to say in our passage that the food that they eat, it perishes as it's used up by the body. Likewise, the Old Testament ceremonial laws have been used up. They are no longer of any value. They've been done away with. Because of Christ's perfect sacrifice, the temple in Jerusalem was outmoded. It was obsolete. It was destined for destruction. And all of the laws surrounding and related to the temple are likewise obsolete. And so, as Beale says, when such laws are made a requirement for Christians, then a corrupt religion is created, which in fact is idolatrous. When we add to God's law, when we make up new rules and regulations for the Christian faith, we are saying that Christ and his sacrifice are not enough. There is more that I must do to be saved. Jesus didn't pay it all. And that brings us to the third and the final point of the sermon, pathetic ascetics. As Paul says in verse 23, these have indeed an appearance of wisdom in promoting self-made religion and asceticism and severity to the body, but they are of no value in stopping the indulgence of the flesh. These regulations that the false teachers have come up with, they make a person appear like a serious Christian, but in reality, they make for a weak man's religion. These rules can't even stop the indulgences of the flesh. The made-up wisdom that results in these types of rules and false religion, they go along with stands in contrast to the wisdom of which Paul speaks in chapter 1, verse 9, where he said, and so from the day we heard, we have not ceased to pray for you, asking that you may be filled with the knowledge of his will in all spiritual wisdom and understanding. Paul wants the Colossians to have godly wisdom, not man-made wisdom. He wants them to know God's will for them, not the will of the false teachers. Man-made rules emanating from man-made religion serves one purpose, to elevate the men who make them up. And so if you're the one who makes them up, or you're the one who adopts man-made rules as your own, you are engaging in the idolatry of self-worship. You're using your fastidiousness and asceticism to elevate yourself above your brothers and sisters. You are looking down on them. You are calling what is clean, what God has made clean, common. Now, I have known Christians who have looked upon their brothers and sisters with absolute disdain because they eat meat. And to be honest, I probably am guilty of looking upon vegetarians with disdain because they don't eat meat. So I guess it goes a little both ways. But they'll say, and I've heard them say, they've said to me, don't you know that eating meat is cruelty to animals? But I also know vegetarians who can't eat meat because of health reasons who are very humble about it. They would never dream of imposing their food restrictions on anyone else. But they know that if they eat certain kinds of foods, especially meat, it might end up leading to their early death. But really, we do this with just about anything. It's not just about food, is it? We use anything to elevate ourselves above our brothers and sisters in Christ. Oh, you read that translation of the Bible? Wow. I didn't know you were that kind of Christian. Are you sure you're a Christian? All of these peripherals, all of these add-ons, these fetishistic ascetics will avail you of nothing. They're pathetic. They can't stop you from indulging in fleshly ways because they are of the flesh. They are superficial, they are cosmetic. They give the appearance of being a strong Christian, but they're simply attempts at making other Christians look weak. When Peter was given the vision in Acts chapter 10 of the great sheet descending from heaven, and on the sheet all kinds of animals and reptiles and birds, he heard a voice saying, "Rise, Peter, kill and eat." And Peter said, "I have never eaten anything common or unclean." And the voice responded to Peter in his vision, "What God has made clean, do not call common." God has made his people clean from the inside out. That's the point of Jesus, what he was saying in Matthew 15. Spiritually speaking, you aren't what you eat. You are what's in your heart. And if the Holy Spirit inhabits your heart, then you are clean, brothers and sisters. Man-made religion and all of its rules can be reduced down to this: faith plus works. The rules you make up out of thin air simply serve to make you righteous in your own eyes, and maybe you'll win some accolades from Christians who are looking at you and saying, wow, what a great Christian. But that is not Christianity. You are saved by grace through faith. If by faith in Christ you have died with Christ, then you are dead to the old world and all of its regulations, and it is dead to you. But what this means is that you're not truly dead. You're truly alive if you've died with Christ to the world. And you will live forever. You and all your brothers and sisters whom God has made clean. So what He has made clean, brothers and sisters, you and everyone else here, do not call unclean. Do not call common. You are God's holy people. And that is good news. Let us pray. Our gracious God, we are thankful